At 22,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe, the air is so thin you can barely breathe, so cold it burns your lungs, and so violent it can tear a man apart in seconds. Inside the aluminum belly of a B-24 Liberator, two young Americans stand at open windows gripping 50 caliber machine guns with frozen fingers, watching death approach from every direction. They are waist gunners, and their life expectancy is measured not in years or months, but in missions. Most won't survive their first 10 flights over enemy territory. This is the story of the most terrifying job in World War II aviation, where boys barely old enough to vote were strapped into flying coffins and sent to face the deadliest air defences ever assembled. By the time you finish watching this video, you'll understand why veteran bomber crews called the waist gunner positions the meat grinder, and why so many of these brave young men never made it home to see their families again. What I'm about to show you isn't just another war story. This is a deep dive into the psychological horror, physical agony, and split-second life or death decisions that defined every moment of a waist gunner's existence. From the moment they climbed aboard their aircraft until they either landed safely or died screaming in a burning plane, these men lived in a state of constant terror that most of us can barely imagine. But before we explore the nightmare of combat missions over Germany, we need to understand exactly what transformed ordinary American teenagers into the human weapons system that helped win the war in Europe. The Boeing B-24 Liberator was not built for comfort. It was built to carry death deep into the heart of Nazi Germany and deliver it with devastating precision. At over 67 feet long, with a wingspan stretching nearly 110 feet, this four-engine, heavy bomber was designed around one simple principle: get as many bombs as possible to the target, no matter the cost in human lives. The waist section of the aircraft was essentially a metal tube, filled with ammunition, fuel lines, oxygen systems, and two small windows cut into the sides where the waist gunners would stand during combat. These weren't enclosed turrets like the nose or tail positions. These were literally open windows in the side of an aircraft flying at altitudes where the outside temperature could drop to 60 degrees below zero. Each waist gun position was equipped with a Browning M250 caliber machine gun capable of firing up to 800 rounds per minute. The weapon itself weighed 84 pounds, and when loaded with ammunition, the entire system could weigh over 200 pounds. The gunners had to manually aim, fire, and reload these weapons while standing in a space barely wider than a telephone booth, wearing bulky flight suits, oxygen masks, and parachutes. The ammunition for these guns came in belts that could stretch over 20 feet long when fully loaded. Managing these belts while under attack, with the aircraft pitching and rolling through defensive maneuvers, required incredible physical strength and coordination. But the physical challenges were nothing compared to the psychological warfare that began long before the aircraft ever left the ground. Training to become a waist gunner was designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle extreme stress, claustrophobia, and the constant threat of violent death. The process began at gunnery schools across the United States, where young recruits learned to operate the 50 caliber machine gun system under increasingly difficult conditions. They started with stationary targets, then moving targets, then targets, while the gunner was on a moving platform. The instructors pushed them harder and harder, creating scenarios designed to simulate the chaos and terror of actual combat. Recruits were forced to operate their weapons while instructors shouted at them, set off explosions nearby, and created artificial emergencies that required split-second decision-making. Many washed out during this phase. Those who couldn't handle the stress, the noise, or the physical demands were transferred to other positions or removed from flight training entirely. The military couldn't afford to have someone freeze up or panic during a combat mission when the lives of the entire crew depended on every gunner doing his job. The psychological evaluation was particularly brutal. Military psychologists subjected potential waist gunners to tests designed to measure their tolerance for extreme stress, their ability to function under pressure, and their capacity to kill other human beings at close range. Unlike bombardiers who dropped their weapons from miles above their targets, waist gunners would often see the faces of enemy fighter pilots as they tried to shoot them down. Those who made it through the initial training phase were then subjected to high-altitude simulation exercises. They were placed in pressure chambers that replicated the conditions they would face at combat altitudes. Many discovered they couldn't handle the thin air, the extreme cold, or the disorientation that came with oxygen deprivation. The ones who survived this winnowing process were then sent to advanced combat training, where they learned to work as part of a bomber crew. This was where they discovered that being a waist gunner wasn't just about operating a machine gun. They were also responsible for monitoring the aircraft's systems, assisting with emergency procedures, and serving as extra eyes for the pilot and navigator. During training flights, instructors would simulate equipment failures, enemy attacks, and emergency situations. Trainees learned to change oxygen bottles while under simulated fire, to treat wounded crew members while maintaining their defensive positions, and to operate their weapons even when parts of the aircraft were damaged or destroyed. The mortality rate during training was sobering. Aircraft accidents, equipment failures, and training incidents killed hundreds of potential waist gunners before they ever saw combat. Those who survived the training process knew they were heading into something far more dangerous than anything they had experienced so far. By the time a newly trained waist gunner arrived at his assigned airbase in England or Italy, he had been transformed from a civilian teenager into a highly trained killing machine. But nothing in his training could truly prepare him for the reality of combat missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. The typical combat mission began before dawn with a briefing that would determine whether the crew would return alive that day. Intelligence officers would reveal the target, usually a heavily defended industrial facility, military installation, or transportation hub deep inside Germany. They would show reconnaissance photographs of the target area, mark the locations of known anti-aircraft batteries, and estimate the number of enemy fighter aircraft they could expect to encounter. For waist gunners, these briefings were exercises in controlled terror. They would study photographs of their target, knowing that in a few hours they would be flying directly over those same buildings while hundreds of people on the ground tried to kill them. They learned the locations of flak batteries, the types of anti-aircraft guns they would face, and the altitudes where the defensive fire would be most concentrated. The intelligence officers also briefed them on enemy fighter tactics. German pilots had developed specific techniques for attacking bomber formations, and they knew exactly where the defensive fire from waist guns would be weakest. They would approach from angles that made it difficult for the waist gunners to get a clear shot, and they would coordinate their attacks to overwhelm the defensive fire from multiple directions simultaneously. After the briefing, the crew would collect their equipment and perform pre-flight checks on their aircraft. For waist gunners, this meant inspecting their machine guns, checking the ammunition supply, testing the oxygen system, and ensuring that their heated flight suits were working properly. Any equipment failure during the mission could mean the difference between life and death. The pre-flight ritual also included a final check of personal equipment. Waist gunners carried emergency medical supplies, survival gear in case they were shot down over enemy territory, and personal items that might bring them luck during the mission. Many carried photographs of family members, religious symbols, or small mementos from home. As the engine started and the aircraft began to taxi toward the runway, the psychological pressure intensified. The waist gunners would take their positions and begin the final equipment checks. They would test fire their guns, adjust their oxygen masks, and prepare themselves mentally for what was coming. The takeoff was often the last peaceful moment of the mission. As the heavily loaded bomber struggled into the air, the crew members would settle into their positions and begin the long flight toward enemy territory. For the first hour or two, there was relatively little danger. They were still over friendly territory, and enemy fighters rarely ventured this far from their home bases. But as they approached the coast of occupied Europe, everything changed. The radio chatter became more urgent. The formation tightened up for mutual protection, and every crew member began scanning the sky for signs of enemy aircraft. The waist gunners would check their weapons one final time, adjust their positions for maximum mobility, and prepare themselves for the fight of their lives. The moment they crossed into enemy airspace, they entered a world where death could come from any direction at any second. Anti-aircraft batteries on the ground would begin tracking their formation, calculating firing solutions that could fill the sky with deadly metal fragments. Enemy fighter aircraft would begin assembling for coordinated attacks designed to break up the bomber formation and pick off individual aircraft. For the waist gunners, this was where their training, their courage, and their survival instincts would be tested in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The first indication that enemy fighters were approaching came through the intercom system. The tail gunner, or top turret operator, would spot distant specks on the horizon, growing larger by the second. Their voices would crackle through the static, calm but urgent. Bandits at 2 o'clock high, coming in fast. For the waist gunners, these words triggered an immediate transformation from nervous anticipation to lethal focus. German fighter tactics had evolved throughout the war into a science of bomber destruction. The Luftwaffe pilots knew exactly where each gun position could and could not fire effectively. They understood the blind spots in the B-24's defensive coverage, and they exploited these weaknesses with surgical precision. The waist gun positions, while covering the critical middle section of the aircraft, had significant limitations that experienced enemy pilots used to their advantage. Focke-Wulf 19s and Messerschmitt 19s would approach from the front quarters, where the waist gunners couldn't engage them until they passed the wing line. This gave the German fighters precious seconds to line up their shots without taking defensive fire. They would dive down from higher altitudes, building tremendous speed before pulling up into firing position. The closing rate between a diving fighter and a bomber could exceed 600 miles per hour, giving both sides only seconds to acquire targets and fire. When the enemy fighters reached firing range, the entire aircraft would erupt in controlled chaos. The waist gunners would swing their heavy machine guns toward the attacking aircraft, fighting against the weapon's inertia and the aircraft's movement through turbulent air. The 50 caliber guns would begin their distinctive hammering rhythm, sending streams of armor-piercing and incendiary rounds toward targets that seemed to dance and weave through the sky. The noise inside the aircraft during combat was beyond human comprehension. The sound of multiple machine guns firing simultaneously, combined with the roar of the engines and the whistle of wind through damaged sections of the fuselage, created an auditory assault that could permanently damage hearing. Many waist gunners stuffed cotton in their ears, but this made it impossible to hear commands from other crew members or warnings about incoming attacks. The physical stress of operating the waist guns during combat pushed human endurance to its absolute limits. The weapons had to be manually aimed and fired while the aircraft pitched and rolled through defensive maneuvers. The pilot would throw the massive bomber into steep turns, sudden climbs, and diving descents to avoid enemy fire and anti-aircraft bursts. The waist gunners had to maintain their balance and continue firing accurately while being thrown around the cramped gun compartment like ragdolls. The ammunition belts created their own set of problems during extended firefights. As the guns consumed rounds at tremendous rates, the spent brass casings would accumulate on the floor of the aircraft, creating a slippery, dangerous surface that could cause a gunner to lose his footing at a critical moment. The ammunition belts themselves would become tangled or kinked, causing weapon jams that had to be cleared while under fire. Enemy fighters didn't attack individually. They came in coordinated waves with multiple aircraft approaching from different angles simultaneously. This forced the waist gunners to make split-second decisions about which targets posed the greatest threat. A fighter approaching from the left might be closer, but another one coming from the right might have a better firing angle. These life-or-death calculations had to be made instantly, while bullets and cannon shells streaked past the open gun positions. The Germans had also developed specialized ammunition designed specifically for attacking bomber formations. Their cannon shells contained explosive charges that could tear massive holes in aircraft structures. A single hit from a 20mm cannon round could destroy a gun position, kill a crew member, or damage critical aircraft systems. The waist gunners could see these projectiles as they flew past, glowing tracers that marked the path of death through the air around them. Anti-aircraft fire presented a different but equally deadly threat. The German flak batteries on the ground would begin firing as soon as the bomber formations came within range, filling the sky with exploding shells designed to bring down aircraft through shrapnel damage rather than direct hits. The waist gunners could see these black puffs of smoke appearing throughout the formation, each one representing hundreds of metal fragments moving at lethal velocities. A direct flak hit on the waist section of a B-24 was almost always fatal for the gunners stationed there. The explosive force would tear through the thin aluminum skin of the aircraft and turn everything inside into shrapnel. Even near misses could cause devastating damage, with shell fragments punching through the fuselage and ricocheting around the interior of the aircraft. The psychological impact of watching other aircraft in the formation get hit was perhaps the most difficult aspect of the waist gunners' experience. They had front row seats to witness B-24s exploding in mid-air, breaking apart under enemy fire, or spinning down in flames with crew members trapped inside. They could see parachutes deploying from damaged aircraft, knowing that some of their friends might be floating down into enemy territory where capture or death awaited them. During particularly intense battles, the waist gunners would watch aircraft disappear from the formation one by one. A bomber that had been flying in perfect formation just moments before would suddenly develop a pronounced list, fall behind the group, and become easy prey for enemy fighters. The surviving crew members in other aircraft could only watch helplessly as their friends fought for their lives in aircraft that were no longer capable of defending themselves. The emotional strain of these experiences was compounded by the physical exhaustion of extended combat. Missions over heavily defended targets could involve hours of continuous fighting, with enemy fighters attacking in relays and anti-aircraft fire following the formation throughout its flight path. The waist gunners had to remain alert and ready to fire for the entire duration of the mission, knowing that a moment's inattention could result in their death or the death of their crewmates. Oxygen deprivation added another layer of complexity to the combat environment. At high altitudes, the human brain begins to function less efficiently due to lack of oxygen. Decision-making becomes slower, reaction times increase, and coordination deteriorates. The waist gunners had to monitor their oxygen supply constantly, change bottles when necessary, and recognise the signs of oxygen starvation in themselves and their fellow crew members. The cold at combat altitudes was so severe that exposed skin would freeze in seconds. Despite heated flight suits and multiple layers of clothing, many waist gunners suffered frostbite during extended missions. Their hands, gripping metal gun handles for hours at a time, were particularly vulnerable. Some gunners lost fingers to frostbite, while others suffered permanent nerve damage that affected their ability to operate weapons effectively. Equipment failures during combat created nightmare scenarios that tested every aspect of a waist gunner's training and resolve. Machine guns would jam at critical moments, forcing the gunner to clear the malfunction while under enemy fire. Oxygen systems would fail, requiring emergency procedures that had to be executed while maintaining defensive fire. Electrical systems would short out, leaving sections of the aircraft without power or communication. When waist gunners were wounded during combat, they faced an impossible choice between seeking medical attention and maintaining their defensive position. A wounded gunner who abandoned his post left a critical gap in the aircraft's defences, potentially exposing the entire crew to increased danger. Many chose to continue fighting despite serious injuries, bleeding heavily while trying to operate their weapons and protect their fellow crew members. The bond between crew members became the only thing that kept many waist gunners functioning during these extreme situations. They knew that their survival depended entirely on every other person in the aircraft doing his job perfectly under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. This mutual dependence created relationships that went far beyond ordinary friendship, forged in the crucible of shared terror and common purpose. The moment a waist gunner was hit by enemy fire, the entire dynamic of the aircraft changed. Blood on the metal floor created a slippery surface that made movement treacherous. The wounded man's screams could be heard even over the roar of engines and gunfire, a sound that carved itself into the memories of surviving crew members for the rest of their lives. Yet the mission had to continue, and the remaining gunner had to cover both positions while his wounded comrade either fought through his injuries or slowly bled to death beside him. Medical training for waist gunners was minimal by necessity. They learned basic first aid, how to apply pressure bandages, and how to administer morphine injections. But treating serious combat wounds while under fire, at altitude, and in the confined space of an aircraft required improvisation and desperate creativity. Many gunners used ammunition belts as tourniquets, torn clothing as bandages, and whatever tools they could find to keep wounded crew members alive until they could reach friendly territory. The psychological impact of watching a close friend die in combat was devastating. Waist gunners often worked in pairs, covering each other's blind spots and sharing ammunition when one position ran low. These partnerships developed into deep bonds forged under the most extreme circumstances. When one partner was killed, the survivor had to continue fighting while his friend's body lay nearby, sometimes for hours, until the mission was complete. Some waist gunners broke under this pressure. Combat fatigue, known today as post-traumatic stress disorder, manifested in various ways during missions. Some men would freeze at their guns, unable to fire at approaching enemy aircraft. Others would fire continuously at empty sky, burning through ammunition while hallucinating targets that weren't there. A few would simply curl up on the floor of the aircraft, overwhelmed by terror and unable to function. The crew members who witnessed these breakdowns faced an impossible moral dilemma. They needed every gun operational to survive enemy attacks, but they couldn't abandon a fellow crew member who was suffering a psychological collapse. Some aircraft commanders would order other crew members to physically restrain gunners who had broken down, while others would try to talk them through their panic attacks over the intercom system. The return journey from the target presented its own unique set of challenges. Damaged aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and airspeed, making them easy targets for enemy fighters that prowled the skies looking for wounded bombers. The waist gunners in these crippled aircraft had to maintain their vigilance even as their plane lost altitude and fell behind the protection of the main formation. Many B-24s limped home on 2 or 3 engines, with gaping holes in their fuselages and critical systems damaged or destroyed. The waist gunners in these aircraft often had to deal with additional responsibilities beyond their normal duties. They might be called upon to help operate manual landing gear systems, assist with emergency navigation, or help treat wounded crew members in other positions. The sight of the English coast or Italian airfields after a successful mission created an emotional release that many veterans described as overwhelming. The knowledge that they had survived another mission, that they would live to see another day, often brought grown men to tears. But this relief was always tempered by the awareness that they would have to do it all again in just a few days, and that each successive mission reduced their statistical chances of survival. Landing a heavily damaged bomber required skills that went far beyond normal flight procedures. Aircraft with damaged landing gear might have to belly land on the runway, a procedure that could result in fires, explosions, or the aircraft breaking apart on impact. Waist gunners had to prepare for emergency evacuation procedures while simultaneously helping to operate emergency systems that might be needed during the landing approach. Some aircraft were so badly damaged that they couldn't make it back to their home bases. These planes would attempt to reach neutral countries like Switzerland or Sweden, where the crew would be interned for the duration of the war, but would survive their ordeal. Other damaged bombers would try to reach Soviet territory, where the patriated through crews might be re-complex diplomatic arrangements. The waist gunners who did make it back to base faced a debriefing process that was both necessary for intelligence purposes and psychologically traumatic for the participants. Intelligence officers would question each crew member extensively about enemy fighter tactics, anti-aircraft positions, and the effectiveness of defensive fire. These sessions often forced the gunners to relive the most terrifying moments of their missions in clinical detail. After debriefing, the surviving crew members would return to their quarters to wait for the next mission assignment. The empty bunks of crew members who hadn't returned served as constant reminders of the mortality that surrounded them. Personal belongings of missing airmen would be collected and shipped home to families who might not yet know their loved ones were dead or missing. The rotation system for bomber crews created a countdown mentality that affected every aspect of a waste gunner's psychological state. Most crews were required to complete 25 combat missions before they could return to the United States. Each successful mission brought them one step closer to survival, but it also meant that the statistical odds were mounting against them with every flight. The mathematics of survival were brutal and inescapable. If each mission had a 10% casualty rate, the chances of surviving 25 missions dropped to approximately 7%. These calculations were well known among the crew members, and they created a psychological pressure that intensified as each man approached his final missions. Some waste gunners developed elaborate superstitions and rituals designed to improve their chances of survival. They would wear the same clothing on every mission, carry lucky charms, or perform specific actions before takeoff. These behaviours provided psychological comfort in situations where the participants had very little control over their own fate. The replacement crews that arrived to fill the positions of killed or wounded airmen were often viewed with a mixture of sympathy and superstition by veteran gunners. The new arrivals represented fresh hope for the squadron's effectiveness, but they also served as reminders of the mortality that claimed so many of their predecessors. Many replacement gunners were given the belongings of dead crew members, sleeping in their bunks and using their equipment. Training replacement waste gunners in combat conditions was a challenge that fell partly on the shoulders of experienced survivors. These veterans had to share their hard-won knowledge of enemy tactics, equipment maintenance, and survival techniques while simultaneously dealing with their own psychological trauma and preparing for their next missions. The weather over Europe added another dimension of danger to every mission. Severe thunderstorms could scatter bomber formations and leave individual aircraft vulnerable to fighter attack. Ice formation on aircraft surfaces could make the planes difficult to control and reduce the effectiveness of defensive armament. Clouds could hide enemy fighters until they were close enough to launch devastating attacks. Navigation errors caused by weather conditions sometimes led bomber formations over heavily defended areas that were supposed to be avoided. Waste gunners in these situations would find themselves under intense anti-aircraft fire without warning, facing defensive concentrations that could destroy entire formations in minutes. The seasonal changes in European weather patterns affected mission planning and survival rates throughout the war. Winter missions involved additional challenges from extreme cold and reduced daylight hours. Summer missions faced different problems with increased enemy fighter activity and longer days that extended the time aircraft spent over hostile territory. Equipment maintenance between missions was critical for waste gunner survival, but the pace of combat operations often left insufficient time for proper care of weapons and support systems. Guns that had fired thousands of rounds during combat missions needed extensive cleaning and adjustment to function reliably on subsequent flights. Ammunition had to be inspected, counted, and properly loaded into the aircraft. The supply chain that kept waste gunners equipped and operational was a massive logistical undertaking that stretched from factories in the United States to forward air bases in England and Italy. Disruptions in this supply chain could leave gunners with insufficient ammunition, defective equipment, or weapons that had been improperly maintained by overworked ground crews. The psychological toll of repeated combat missions created a phenomenon that military psychiatrists struggled to understand and treat. Waste gunners who survived their first few missions often developed what crews called the 1,000-yard stare, a hollow expression that reflected the emotional numbness necessary to function in their deadly environment. These men had witnessed horrors that civilian minds couldn't process, and they carried those images with them every waking moment. Sleep became elusive for veteran waist gunners. The combination of physical exhaustion and psychological trauma created a state where their bodies desperately needed rest, but their minds refused to shut down. Many reported vivid nightmares featuring burning aircraft, screaming crew members, and the faces of enemy pilots they had killed in combat. Others found themselves unable to sleep at all, lying awake in their bunks while replaying the events of recent missions over and over in their minds. The medical facilities at bomber bases were overwhelmed with cases of what was then called combat fatigue. Flight surgeons worked around the clock treating physical wounds, but they had limited understanding of how to help men whose psychological injuries were invisible, yet equally devastating. Many waist gunners who could no longer function in combat were simply transferred to non-flying duties. Their military careers effectively ended by trauma that wouldn't be properly understood for decades. Alcohol became a common method of self-medication for gunners struggling with the psychological pressure of repeated combat exposure. Base commanders often looked the other way when off-duty airmen drank heavily, understanding that these men needed some form of emotional release from the constant threat of death. However, alcohol-related incidents sometimes resulted in disciplinary action that could affect a crew member's ability to complete his required missions and return home. The mail system that connected airmen with their families back home created both comfort and additional psychological pressure. Letters from loved ones provided emotional support and reminded the gunners what they were fighting for, but they also increased the stakes of survival. Men who might have been willing to take extreme risks for abstract concepts like duty or patriotism became more cautious when they had specific faces and voices calling them home. Writing letters to family members became increasingly difficult as missions accumulated. How could a waist gunner explain to his parents or girlfriend what he experienced during combat without causing them unbearable worry? Many chose to minimize the dangers they faced, creating cheerful fiction about their military service while privately struggling with experiences that defied description in normal language. The censorship system that reviewed all outgoing mail created additional frustration for airmen trying to maintain connections with home. Military censors would black out any information that might compromise operational security, sometimes leaving letters so heavily redacted that families couldn't understand what their loved ones were trying to communicate. This disconnect between the reality of combat and the sanitized version that reached the home front created a sense of isolation that compounded the psychological pressure. Religious faith played a complex role in the psychological survival of waist gunners. Some men found comfort in prayer and the belief that divine protection would see them through their missions. Others struggled with questions about why a benevolent God would allow such suffering and destruction. Base chaplains worked tirelessly to provide spiritual guidance, but they faced the challenge of ministering to men who had witnessed humanity at its absolute worst. The superstitions that developed among bomber crews reflected desperate attempts to exert some control over circumstances that were largely beyond human influence. Lucky charms, specific routines, and ritual behaviors became psychological anchors that helped gunners maintain their sanity in an insane environment. These practices were tolerated and even encouraged by commanders who understood their importance for crew morale and effectiveness. Group dynamics within bomber crews created their own psychological pressures. The need to maintain unit cohesion and mutual trust sometimes prevented individuals from expressing their fears or seeking help for psychological problems. A waist gunner who admitted to being afraid might be seen as unreliable by his crewmates, potentially endangering everyone's survival. This pressure to appear brave and competent often forced men to internalize their trauma rather than seek the help they desperately needed. The replacement system that brought new crew members into established units created additional psychological stress for veteran gunners. Forming emotional bonds with new arrivals meant risking the pain of losing another friend to combat. Some veterans deliberately maintained emotional distance from replacements, treating them as temporary additions rather than permanent crew members. This defensive mechanism protected the veterans from additional relief. But often, left new arrivals feeling isolated and unwelcome. The young men who served as waist gunners on B-24 Liberators paid the ultimate price for victory in the skies over Europe. Their sacrifice reminds us that freedom isn't free, and that ordinary people can demonstrate extraordinary courage when faced with impossible circumstances. We must never forget their story, because forgetting their sacrifice dishonors the memory of every airman who never made it home.